I stood in the pouring rain with a shattered heart and a secret growing inside my womb, watching the man I loved walk away with his beautiful lie. Welcome back to your BL boyfriend. If you are ready for an unforgettable BL journey filled with agonizing heartbreak, shocking betrayals, and the sweet taste of revenge, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a massive like, and share your thoughts in the comments down below. Your support means the world to us and fuels our passion to bring you the best stories. Grab a cozy blanket, prepare your tissues, and let's dive into the pain and triumph of today's tale. Part 1. The Echo of Shattered Vows. The heavy, imposing oak doors of the Grand Hayes estate had always felt somewhat intimidating, but today they felt like the gates of a prison rather than the entrance to the home I had loved and cherished for 3 long years. My name is Julian. For as long as my memory could serve me, my voice had been permanently trapped behind an invisible, impenetrable wall. It had been stolen from me by a horrific childhood trauma that left my vocal cords paralyzed, rendering me entirely mute. I lived in a silent world. I couldn't scream when I was boiling with anger. I couldn't whisper sweet, comforting nothings into the dark of the night. And most devastatingly of all, I couldn't speak up to defend myself when my entire reality was being violently torn apart. I sat on the edge of our massive king-sized bed, the silk sheets cold beneath my trembling thighs. My fingers, shaking uncontrollably, clutched a small, white plastic stick. 2 distinct, glaringly pink lines. A positive pregnancy test. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird desperately seeking an escape. I was an Omega, and against all the grim medical odds and countless doctors who had solemnly predicted I might never be able to conceive due to my weak constitution, I was finally, miraculously carrying the child of my alpha, Arthur Hayes. Arthur was my entire universe. He was the sole heir to the most powerful and ruthless corporate empire in Luminous City, a man whose cold, unyielding exterior melted only for me. Or, at least, that was the beautiful fantasy I had foolishly convinced myself was real. I had spent the entire morning in a state of euphoric bliss, meticulously wrapping the little pregnancy test in a delicate, dark blue velvet box, tying it with a pristine silver silk ribbon. I had spent hours imagining the exact look on his face when I handed it to him. I pictured the way his sharp, icy blue eyes that usually held the weight of 1,000 business empires, would suddenly soften with overwhelming warmth. I imagined the way his strong, capable arms would wrap around my waist, lifting me high into the air with a triumphant, joyous laugh. But the universe, as I was about to learn, possessed a cruel, twisted, and deeply unforgiving sense of humor. The jarring sound of the heavy front door downstairs slamming shut with violent force echoed through the silent, cavernous mansion, violently snapping me out of my hopeful daydream. It wasn't Arthur's usual calm, calculated, and measured return from the corporate office. Instead, there were heavy, furious footsteps stomping up the grand marble staircase. Each step sounded like a clap of thunder, and they were accompanied by the muffled, pathetic sounds of someone openly sobbing. I quickly shoved the velvet box under my silk pillow, my stomach suddenly knotting with an inexplicable, suffocating dread. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the dense, suffocating scent of an enraged alpha flooded the hallway. I stood up from the bed, just as the bedroom door was thrown open so forcefully that the brass handle cracked sharply against the pristine plaster wall, leaving a deep, ugly dent. There stood Arthur. He was radiating a terrifying, almost suffocating alpha aura that made my weak Omega knees buckle beneath me. His broad chest was heaving with exertion, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it were carved from solid granite. And standing slightly behind him, clutching the sleeve of Arthur's expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket with trembling, delicate hands, was Elias. Elias, Arthur's ex-boyfriend, an Omega whose ethereal beauty was only matched by his venomous, manipulative, and deeply rotten heart. I took a hesitant step forward, raising my hands to sign, desperate to ask what was wrong, to soothe the monstrous rage radiating from my husband. But Arthur raised a large, heavy hand, stopping me dead in my tracks. His eyes, the exact same blue eyes I had kissed 1,000 times in the quiet intimacy of the night, were entirely devoid of any warmth, love, or familiarity. They looked at me not as a cherished husband, not as a mate, but as a disgusting, vile stranger who had personally offended him. "Don't," Arthur growled, his voice a lethal, low vibration that sent a violent shiver down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. "Don't you dare wave your pathetic hands at me and pretend you don't know exactly what you've done. Don't play the innocent, silent, fragile victim today, Julian. I am entirely sick of the act." My breath hitched painfully in my throat. I shook my head frantically, my hands desperately moving in a flurry of motion. "Arthur, what are you talking about? What happened? Why are you so angry? Before Arthur could even attempt to decipher my frantic gestures, Elias let out a theatrical, violently trembling sob, burying his flawless face against Arthur's broad shoulder. I told you, Arthur, Elias whispered, his voice dripping with a fabricated agony that made my stomach churn with disgust. I didn't want to tell you. I know how much you loved him. I know how much you sacrificed to bring a broken Omega into your prestigious family. I didn't want to be the one to break your heart and shatter your illusion, but I couldn't let him make a fool out of you anymore. I couldn't stand by and watch him humiliate you. I saw them, Arthur. I saw him with the rival Pax Alpha. They were laughing together. He was touching his arm, and the way they looked at each other, it wasn't innocent. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the undeniable look of secret lovers. The world violently tilted on its axis. The lavish bedroom spun around me in a sickening blur. My mind went entirely blank for a fraction of a second, completely unable to process the sheer audacity of the lie, before roaring back to life with absolute, blinding panic. No, I signed wildly, stepping closer, my hands moving so fast they were practically a blur. He is lying. Arthur, please, you have to look at me. He is lying to you. I haven't been anywhere near anyone else. I don't even know what he is talking about. I have been right here, waiting for you to come home. Stop lying to my face. Arthur roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings like a physical blow. He lunged forward and roughly swatted my hands away. The physical rejection felt like a jagged, rusty knife plunging straight into the center of my chest. He had never, not once in our entire 3 years of marriage, used physical force to interrupt my signing. To swat my hands away was to literally silence me, to strip away my only means of communication. It was the ultimate, most degrading disrespect to my condition. Elias showed me the photographs, Julian. Arthur shouted, his face contorted with a mixture of grief and pure rage. He showed me the time-stamped security footage from the downtown cafe. Do not try to deny it. You sneaked out of this house while I was locked in a crucial board meeting. You were with Damien. Damien. The name hit me like a bucket of ice water. Damien was the rival Alpha. He was a ruthless, underhanded man who had been aggressively trying to sabotage Arthur's company for months, stopping at nothing to ruin the Hayes Empire. The horrific truth of the situation finally dawned on me. 2 days ago, I had walked to the downtown cafe to buy Arthur's favorite artisan pastries, hoping to surprise him. While I was waiting for my order, Damien had cornered me. He had grabbed my arm aggressively, his grip bruising my skin, threatening me, trying to intimidate me into passing a vile message to my husband. I had fought him off, terrified, and ran out of the cafe without the pastries, too paralyzed by fear to burden Arthur with the incident because Arthur was already under an immense, crushing amount of stress from the corporate war. Elias, who must have been stalking me or simply present by sheer unlucky coincidence, had seen the interaction. He had captured the exact split-second moment Damien grabbed my arm, taken a photograph out of context, and twisted a moment of harassment into a vile, disgusting narrative of infidelity and treason. I reached for Arthur's crisp white shirt, desperately pulling at the expensive fabric, my eyes swimming with heavy, hot, blinding tears. I mouthed the word no, over and over again, begging him to read my lips, begging him to look past his blind rage and see the desperate truth shining in my tear-filled gaze. I was attacked. He grabbed me. Please, Arthur, you know me. You know I would never. My silent screams echoed in my own mind. But Arthur tore himself away from my desperate grip, as if my touch physically burned his skin. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. How could you? Arthur's voice suddenly cracked, dropping from a roar to a devastated whisper, and that subtle, agonizing break in his tone broke me completely. I gave you everything, Julian. I gave you a life. I defended you against my own mother and father, against the entire board of directors who said I shouldn't marry a broken, mute, useless Omega. I built a sanctuary for us. And you betray me? With the one man who is actively trying to destroy my legacy. Elias sniffled pitifully from the background, wiping an invisible tear from his flawless cheek. He probably sold your company's secrets, Arthur, Elias murmured, twisting the knife even deeper. Omegas like him, they always use their pathetic disabilities to play the victim, to garner sympathy, while secretly plotting in the shadows. He used your love against you. I lunged toward Elias, pure, unadulterated fury coursing through my veins. I wanted to wrap my hands around his perfect throat and squeeze until he confessed the truth. But Arthur immediately stepped between us, throwing his broad chest out, acting as a physical shield for the man who was actively, maliciously destroying our lives. The sight of my own husband, my alpha, my mate, Protecting his ex-boyfriend from me was the final, fatal blow. The remaining air violently left my lungs. The strength vanished from my legs, and I collapsed onto the cold hardwood floor, clutching my chest as silent, agonizing, body-racking sobs tore through me. I couldn't even scream out the unbearable grief that was ripping my soul to shreds. My heartbreak was an entirely silent, invisible tragedy. "Get up," Arthur demanded, his tone turning to absolute, unforgiving ice. He was no longer the man who held me when I had nightmares. He was a machine now, a ruthless, calculating businessman cutting ties with a bad, toxic investment. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, legally bound, folded document. He tossed it onto the floor with a flick of his wrist. It landed right in front of my trembling knees with a sickening, definitive thud. I stared down at the bold, black letters printed across the top of the first page, my vision blurring. Divorce agreement and severance of mating bond. "Sign it," Arthur ordered, his voice devoid of any remaining emotion. "You get absolutely nothing. No alimony, no properties, no shares in the company, and no payout. You pack whatever fits into one single suitcase, and you leave my house within the hour. If you ever try to contact me, if you ever try to reach out to my family, or if you ever go anywhere near Elias again, I will personally ensure that you disappear from this city forever. You will be a ghost." I looked up at him through a blurry, stinging curtain of tears. I raised my hands one last time. "Please." I signed excruciatingly slowly, my fingers shaking so violently I could barely form the simple shapes. "Arthur, I love you. I am your mate. Please do not do this." "I don't love you anymore," Arthur replied, staring directly into my eyes, delivering the words with the lethal, unhesitating precision of a trained sniper. "Looking at you right now, I'm not even sure I ever truly did. You weren't a partner, Julian. You were just a pathetic charity project that went horribly, embarrassingly wrong." Those words killed whatever fragile, desperate hope was left fluttering in the darkest corners of my soul. A strange, eerie, deeply unnatural calm washed over me, violently numbing the excruciating, burning pain in my chest. I slowly lowered my hands, placing them flat against the cold floor. I looked at Elias, who was hiding a wicked, triumphant, incredibly cruel smirk behind his delicate, manicured hand. Then I looked back at Arthur, the man I had worshipped as a god. The man whose child was currently, at this very second, taking shelter deep inside my womb. If I told him about the baby right now, he wouldn't believe it was his. He was too poisoned by Elias's lies. He would accuse me of trying to pass off Damien's bastard child as a legitimate Hayes heir to secure a financial payout. He would call my innocent child dirty. He might even use his immense wealth and power to force me to terminate the pregnancy to avoid a scandal. Instinct, raw, ancient, and deeply primal, suddenly flared to life inside me. It was the undeniable Omega instinct to protect my unborn pup at absolutely all costs, surpassing even my love for my mate. Arthur had made his choice. He actively chose a fabricated lie over my desperate truth. He chose the comfort of Elias over the sanctity of our vows. He did not deserve to know about the absolute miracle growing inside me. He had forfeited his right to be a father the second he told me I was a charity project. I reached out and picked up the expensive silver pen that had fallen beside the legal papers. With a steady, unyielding hand that surprised even my own fractured mind, I signed my name on the dotted line, officially severing my life from his. I didn't read the clauses. I didn't care about the billions of dollars, the social status, or the luxury cars. I just wanted to survive this room with my pup intact. I stood up slowly, completely ignoring the intense, sharp, burning pain that suddenly flared in my lower abdomen from the extreme stress. I didn't look at Arthur again, not even a passing glance. I walked to the walk-in closet and pulled out my oldest, most beaten-up suitcase, the exact same battered, cheap suitcase I had brought with me when I first moved into this mansion 3 years ago. I threw a few plain, unbranded shirts, 2 pairs of simple pants, and my old, heavy winter coat inside. I didn't touch the expensive diamond jewelry, the designer clothes he had bought me, or the limitless platinum credit cards. I took only what was truly, undeniably mine before I met him. Before zipping the bag closed, I paused. I reached under my silk pillow. My cold fingers brushed against the soft velvet box containing the positive pregnancy test. I pulled it out and slipped it silently, secretly, into the deep pocket of my old winter coat. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and walked out of the bedroom, passing right by them without a single glance or a final goodbye. I didn't bow my head in shame, I didn't plead for mercy, and I certainly didn't shed another tear in their presence. As I walked down the grand, sweeping marble staircase and pushed open the heavy oak doors, The rain was coming down in violent, freezing sheets, washing over the expansive driveway. It soaked through my thin clothes instantly, chilling me to the bone, but I barely registered the physical discomfort. I walked out into the storm, leaving the gates of the Hayes estate behind forever. I stopped at the edge of the road, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I placed a trembling, highly protective hand over my completely flat stomach. We don't need him, I thought, a fierce, protective, raging fire violently igniting in the hollow cavern of my chest. I will be your mother and your father. I will endure any hardship, I will fight any battle, and I will give you the entire world. And he will never, ever know you exist. 5 arduous, grueling months later, the bitter, unforgiving cold of a deep winter had completely settled over the distant, isolated, incredibly small coastal town I had fled to. I had traveled as far away from Luminous City as my meager, saved-up cash could take me. I now lived in a tiny, severely drafty, one-bedroom apartment directly above a local bakery, working impossibly long, back-breaking hours needing heavy dough in absolute silence just to pay for my incredibly meager existence. My body had changed drastically. My belly had swollen significantly, becoming incredibly heavy and protruding much further than what the local midwife said was typical for only 5 months of gestation. My lower back ached with a constant, throbbing agony, and my feet were permanently, painfully swollen, but every tiny flutter, every sharp, sudden kick from inside my womb, was a beautiful, profound reminder of exactly why I was enduring this immense hardship. Today was the most important day of the month, the day of my comprehensive ultrasound. The small, incredibly underfunded rural clinic smelled strongly of cheap, overpowering antiseptic and old, dusty paper. The kind, deeply wrinkled elderly doctor, Dr. Vance, who knew me only as Run, the brand-new identity I had carefully crafted and assumed to hide permanently from Arthur's vast, powerful reach, smiled warmly at me as I lay back on the uncomfortable examination table. He squirted the freezing cold gel onto my protruding stomach. "All right, Ren," Dr. Vance said, adjusting his thick, wire-rimmed glasses as he stared intensely at the small, blurry, outdated black and white monitor of the ultrasound machine. "Let's see how our little one is doing today. You've been measuring quite large, significantly larger than your last checkup, so I honestly wouldn't be surprised if you are carrying a particularly big, strong pup." I watched the fuzzy screen with bated breath, my heart swelling with an unconditional, fierce love that completely overwhelmed my senses. Even though I couldn't speak a word, Dr. Vance had spent the last few months learning to perfectly read my subtle facial expressions and frantic hand gestures. Suddenly, Dr. Vance stopped talking. He frowned deeply, leaning his face much closer to the glowing screen. He moved the plastic wand around my stomach with a sudden, frantic urgency, his gray brow furrowing deeper with every passing second. He tapped a few buttons on the outdated machine, adjusting the contrast, his eyes widening impossibly wide behind his thick lenses. Absolute, paralyzing panic violently seized my throat. I shot up slightly and grabbed his white sleeve, my eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "Is something wrong? Is my baby okay? Is there no heartbeat?" My panicked, terrified face screamed silently. "Run!" Dr. Vance breathed out, his voice completely stunned, almost breathless. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his weathered expression a complex mixture of profound medical shock and absolute, reverent awe. "Ren, I don't know how the previous, earlier scans completely missed this. They must have been hiding behind each other. But, my God." He raised a visibly trembling finger and pointed at the center of the blurry monitor. "There isn't just one heartbeat, Ren," the old doctor whispered, his voice echoing loudly in the deafeningly tiny, quiet room. "There's 1, 2, 3, 4. He moved the wand slightly again, pressing a little harder. 5. Ren, you are carrying 5 distinct, separate, healthy pups. Quintuplets." The tiny examination room violently started to spin. 5. 5 children. Arthur's children. 5 living, breathing pieces of the cruel man who had discarded me like worthless trash. 5 entirely innocent lives that were now entirely, solely dependent on a broken, mute, deeply traumatized Omega who had absolutely no money, no family, and nowhere to run. I pressed both of my hands hard against my mouth to violently stifle the silent, heaving sob of sheer, overwhelming terror and profound, terrifying joy that violently ripped through my chest. The medical odds were practically astronomical. It was a complete medical anomaly, a nearly impossible miracle granted by the moon goddess herself. 5 secret children. As I lay there on that cold table, listening to the rapid, rhythmic, beautiful, chaotic sound of 5 tiny hearts beating in perfect unison through the machine's speakers, a completely new, unbreakable version of me was forged in the fire of that moment. The weak, deeply in love, pathetic Omega, who had cried desperately on the hardwood floor of the Hayes mansion, was officially dead and buried. In his place was a ferocious, unyielding protector, a father who would burn the world down to keep them warm. Let Arthur Hayes keep his miserable, bloodthirsty corporate empire. Let him have his manipulative, lying lover. I now had 5 incredible reasons to conquer the world on my own terms. And one day, the undeniable truth would inevitably rise to the surface. And when that day finally arrived, I would make absolutely certain that Arthur felt exactly, precisely what it was like to lose absolutely everything. End of Part 1. Part 2. The Ghosts of Lumina City. 5 years. A span of time that felt like both a fleeting second and an agonizing eternity. The scent of vanilla, caramelized sugar, and freshly baked bread filled the air of my bustling bakery, the Silent Haven. When I had first arrived in this quiet coastal town, I was a broken, penniless Omega running from a shattered marriage, carrying the weight of an impossible pregnancy. The trauma of Arthur's betrayal had manifested as severe anxiety, making me jump at every sudden noise and fear the shadows. But the moment I held my 5 beautiful children in my arms, a profound, undeniable strength had overridden my fear. They were my anchors to reality, pulling me back from the edge of despair. There was Leo, the eldest by mere minutes, whose calm and fiercely protective nature reminded me far too much of the man I was trying to forget. Then came Finn and Felix, identical twins with endless energy and a mischievous spark. Next was Milo, my gentle beta, whose smile could melt the coldest frost. And finally, little Jasper, the youngest Omega, who clung to my leg and hid behind my aprons whenever strangers entered the shop. I wiped a streak of flour from my forehead, smiling as I watched the 5 of them sit around a large oak table in the back room, their little hands furiously coloring in their sketchbooks. They were the center of my universe. I had built this successful business from scratch, kneading my pain into the dough, turning my silent tears into the sweetest pastries the town had ever tasted. I had become someone entirely new. I was no longer Julian, the weak, discarded husband. I was Ruin, the fiercely independent master baker, a father who would tear the world apart to keep his children safe. But safety is often an illusion, a fragile glass house waiting for a single stone. That stone came in the form of a thick, gold-embossed envelope delivered 2 weeks ago. The National Culinary Expo. It was the most prestigious event in the country, a gateway to massive distribution deals that would secure my children's futures, ensuring they would never have to struggle as I had. The problem? The expo was being held in Lumina City, the capital, Arthur's domain, the place where my heart had been unceremoniously ripped from my chest. Just the thought of returning to that sprawling metropolis sent a cold spike of panic through my nervous system. The familiar symptoms of my old trauma flared up, the tightness in my chest, the cold sweat on my palms, the ringing in my ears. I had spent sleepless nights pacing the floor, weighing the immense risk against the undeniable reward. I couldn't let my past dictate my children's future. I had to face the ghost of the city that broke me. Now, standing in the middle of the massive, echoing terminal of Lumina City Central Station, the sheer scale of my decision hit me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, strong coffees, and the distinct, suffocating aura of powerful alphas and elite omegas bustling past. I tightened my grip on the handle of our shared luggage trolley, my knuckles turning white. I wore a simple, elegant dark coat, a soft cashmere scarf wrapped high around my neck, and a pair of dark sunglasses that shielded my eyes. I had changed over the years. The sickly pale, fragile boy Arthur had thrown away was gone. Hard work, responsibility, and the sheer force of parenthood had sculpted me into a self-assured, resilient man. Papa, look. The buildings are so tall. Finn squealed, his little fingers pointing toward the massive glass walls of the station that revealed the towering skyscrapers of the city. Stay close, Finn. I signed quickly, though I knew he understood my facial expressions just as well. I knelt down, gathering the 5 of them into a tight circle. Remember the rules. What did we say about the big city? Never let go of each other's hands. Felix chimed in, puffing out his little chest. Don't talk to strangers. Milo added, his wide eyes scanning the crowd nervously. And always stay where Papa can see us, Leo finished, his serious gaze locking onto mine. Even at nearly 5 years old, Leo had an intense, analytical stare that made my breath catch. He had Arthur's eyes, that piercing, intelligent blue. I smiled, offering them a gentle nod, and kissed each of their foreheads. Good boys. I am so proud of you. Let's go to the hotel. We moved as a unit, a tight-knit pack navigating the chaotic sea of travelers. I kept my head down, my senses hyper-alert, scanning the crowd for any sign of danger. The anxiety was a low hum in the back of my mind, a survival mechanism trying to warn me that I was back in the lion's den. As we neared the VIP exit, the quickest route to the taxi stands, the crowd suddenly surged forward, a chaotic bottleneck of impatient passengers. "Hold on tight," I mouthed to the kids, ushering them forward. But in the sudden rush, a businessman with a large rolling suitcase aggressively pushed past us. The heavy bag clipped little Jasper's shoulder, spinning him around. Jasper stumbled, his tiny hand slipping from Milo's grasp. Before I could reach him, Jasper tripped over his own feet and tumbled forward, crashing hard into the legs of a man standing just outside the automatic sliding doors. The man stumbled, letting out a sharp, dramatic gasp as the iced coffee in his hand spilled directly onto his pristine, designer white trousers. Time seemed to freeze. The world narrowed down to the sound of Jasper's small whimper as he sat on the marble floor, rubbing his bumped knee. I lunged forward, my heart plummeting into my stomach. But before I could pull my son into my arms, the man turned around, his face twisted in absolute fury. "Watch where you're going, you little brat." The voice hit me like a physical blow. A brutal, agonizing strike to my ribs. The air evaporated from my lungs. My entire body went rigid, locked in an instant, terrifying paralysis of a trauma response. I knew that voice. I would know it in the darkest abyss. I would know it in my nightmares. It was Elias. He was as beautiful and venomous as the day I last saw him. He wore an immaculate, tailored suit, his blonde hair styled perfectly, every inch of him screaming wealth and privilege. But his face was contorted in an ugly sneer as he glared down at my crying child. "Look what you did to my custom slacks. Do you know how much these cost? Where are your incompetent parents?" Elias hissed, raising a hand as if to shove Jasper away. A fiery, primal rage violently shattered my paralysis. The terrified Omega, who had collapsed in tears 5 years ago, was instantly incinerated by the ferocious, protective wrath of a parent. I moved faster than a thought. I positioned myself directly between Elias and my trembling son, my back to the Omega, shielding Jasper completely with my body. I scooped Jasper up, cradling his head against my chest, feeling his tiny, rapid heartbeat against mine. "Papa." Jasper sniffled quietly, burying his face in my scarf. I turned my head just enough to glare at Elias over my shoulder. My dark sunglasses hid the absolute murder in my eyes, but my posture was rigid, dangerous, and utterly unyielding. "Oh, so you do have a parent," Elias scoffed, taking a step back, clearly unnerved by my sudden, silent hostility. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. The Julian he knew was pathetic and weak. "You should teach your kid some manners. He completely ruined my outfit. I expect you to pay for the dry cleaning, though looking at you, I doubt you can afford it." My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I wanted to destroy him. I wanted to reach out and tear the arrogant smirk right off his flawless face. I wanted to scream at him for the lies he spun, for the life he stole, for the pain he inflicted upon the innocent child in my arms. But I couldn't speak, and even if I could, this was not the time or the place. I had to protect my pack. I had to disappear before the unthinkable happened. Because if Elias was here— "Elias, is there a problem?" The deep, commanding, glacial baritone echoed through the terminal. It was a voice that commanded instant obedience, a voice that carried absolute authority. A voice that had once whispered that I was his everything, before coldly telling me I was nothing. "Arthur." The blood drained from my face, leaving me ice cold. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently I thought it might crack my sternum. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at him, if our eyes met, the meticulously constructed wall of my new life would crumble into dust. "Arthur, darling, look," Elias whined, his tone instantly shifting from vicious to a sickeningly sweet victimhood. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicks of Arthur's expensive dress shoes approaching. This man's unruly child ran right into me and ruined my clothes. And the father hasn't even apologized. "I'll have my assistant handle the cleaning bill. Let's go. We're late for the board meeting," Arthur's voice replied. It sounded exhausted, hollow, devoid of the vibrant energy I remembered. There was a strange heaviness to his tone, a cold detachment that sent a shiver down my spine. But Arthur, he was so rude. Elias protested, clearly unsatisfied with the lack of drama. I didn't wait for Arthur to respond. I tightened my hold on Jasper, signaled frantically with my free hand to Leo, Finn, Felix, and Milo, and turned my face entirely away from the approaching Alpha. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice now directed at my back. It was closer, so incredibly close. I could almost feel the sheer weight of his alpha aura pressing against my shoulders, the faint, intoxicating scent of cedarwood and winter air that used to be my home. If my partner frightened your child, I apologize. But you should be more careful. I didn't acknowledge him. I didn't nod. I simply lowered my head, keeping my face hidden behind my collar and sunglasses, and walked away. I practically dragged my children through the sliding doors and into the chaotic, rain-slicked streets of Lumina City. Papa, why are you walking so fast? Felix panted, his little legs working hard to keep up. Is the mean man following us? Milo asked, his voice trembling. I didn't stop until we had rounded a corner and ducked into a secluded alleyway between two massive concrete buildings. Only then did I drop to my knees, gasping for air as if I had been submerged underwater. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I pulled all 5 of my children into a desperate, crushing embrace, burying my face in their small, warm shoulders. I had survived. We had escaped. But the horrifying reality of my situation had never been clearer. They were here. The monsters of my past were walking the same streets. Back inside the terminal, Arthur stood frozen, watching the strange man and the trailing children disappear into the crowd. A profound, inexplicable ache bloomed in the center of his chest. It was a phantom pain he had lived with for 5 long, miserable years. Arthur, what are you looking at? Elias asked, tugging at his arm. Let's go. The car is waiting. Arthur slowly turned his gaze away from the exit. Did you see that man? He murmured, his voice tight. Who? The rude father? Barely. He was hiding his face. Why? Elias frowned, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. His scent, Arthur whispered, his blue eyes narrowing, a dangerous, frantic storm brewing within them. It was faint, muffled by something, but it smelled like vanilla and rain. Elias froze, his manicured hands tightening on his ruined trousers. Vanilla and rain. It was a scent they both knew intimately. A scent that hadn't graced the halls of the estate in 5 years. Don't be ridiculous, Arthur, Elias snapped, his voice sharp with sudden, poorly concealed panic. Julian is gone. He disappeared. And even if he were alive, that man had 5 children with him. 5. It's impossible. Arthur didn't reply. He stared at the spot where the stranger had stood, his mind racing. Elias was right. It was logically impossible. Julian was a frail, mute Omega who couldn't even defend himself, let alone raise 5 children. But the primal, deep-seated instinct of an alpha rarely cared about logic. The way the man had stood, the protective curve of his shoulders, the silent, unyielding refusal to speak. Arthur's chest tightened, a suffocating regret choking him. He had spent 5 years drowning in the bitter realization of his monumental mistake. He had discovered Elias's lies too late. He had found the security footage from the cafe, unedited, proving Julian had been harassed, not unfaithful. He had driven the only pure thing in his life away, condemning him to an unknown fate. Have Jackson pull the security footage from this terminal, Arthur commanded suddenly, his voice lethal and cold, leaving no room for argument. Arthur, you can't be serious. Elias gasped, his facade cracking. I want every angle of that exit from the last 10 minutes, Arthur continued, ignoring Elias completely, his eyes locked on the sliding doors. If it's him, if there is even a fraction of a chance that it's him, I will tear this city apart until I find him. Meanwhile, safe in the confines of our hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching my children sleep peacefully after the exhaustion of the journey. The panic had subsided, replaced by a cold, calculated determination. Arthur had felt something. I knew it. The bond we once shared, though broken, always left an invisible scar. He might come looking. He might try to dig into my new life. But I was no longer the silent victim he could manipulate and discard. If Arthur wanted to uncover the truth, he would find a fortress he could not penetrate. I would win this culinary expo, secure our future, and leave Lumina City before he ever truly realized what he had lost. I gently brushed a lock of hair from Leo's forehead. He shifted in his sleep, his little brow furrowing, an exact mirror of his father. I will protect you, I vowed silently into the dark room. From him. From everyone. You are mine, and I will never let him take you away. The game of hide and seek had officially begun. And this time, I was the one making the rules. End of Part 2. Part 3. The Taste of a Ghost. The suffocating silence of the Hayes Corporation's top-floor executive penthouse was broken only by the sharp, repetitive click of a mouse. The room was shrouded in darkness, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly against the glittering skyline of Lumina City. At the center of the massive mahogany desk sat Arthur, the glow of the computer monitor casting a harsh, pale light across his exhausted, hollowed features. He had been sitting there for 6 agonizing hours, his tailored suit jacket discarded on the floor, his silk tie loosened. On the screen, the grainy, high-definition security footage from the central train station played on an endless, torturous loop. Click. Rewind. Play. Arthur's bloodshot blue eyes meticulously tracked the figure of the slender man in the dark coat. He watched the chaotic bottleneck near the VIP exit. He watched Elias aggressively bump into the small child. But most importantly, he watched the father's reaction. Arthur paused the video at the exact fraction of a second when the stranger had lunged forward to protect the fallen boy. The man had positioned his body like a physical shield, his back entirely to the threat, wrapping the child in a desperate, fiercely protective embrace. The movement was a blur of instinct, but the posture, the slight, elegant curve of the shoulders, the delicate line of the neck exposed above the cashmere scarf. It was a phantom image burned into the deepest, most heavily guarded vaults of Arthur's memory. "It's impossible," Arthur whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking with a terrifying, desperate vulnerability he hadn't shown in half a decade. He was entirely alone. He was frail. He couldn't, 5 children. Arthur leaned closer, his chest aching with a phantom pain that was rapidly becoming unbearable. He zoomed in on the man's hands as he gathered the children. The footage was slightly pixelated, but there, catching the harsh fluorescent light of the terminal, was a faint, jagged, silvery scar across the back of the stranger's left hand. Arthur's breath hitched violently in his throat. The air evaporated from his lungs. 5.5 years ago, while trying to bake Arthur a birthday cake in the massive kitchen of the Hayes estate, a fragile, mute Omega named Julian had accidentally dropped a glass mixing bowl. He had cut his left hand deeply, while frantically trying to clean it up before Arthur saw the mess. Arthur had personally bandaged that wound, kissing the trembling fingers to soothe the silent tears. The man in the video had the exact same scar. Arthur shot up from his leather chair, the heavy piece of furniture tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the floor. His heart was hammering against his ribs with the force of a battering ram. The impossible was staring him right in the face. Julian was alive. He was in Lumina City. And he had 5 children. Arthur's mind violently short-circuited. 5 children. If Julian was pregnant when he left, if Elias had lied about Damien, the horrifying, crushing weight of reality slammed into Arthur like a runaway freight train. The timeline perfectly aligned. Those bright, beautiful children he had briefly seen at the station, the ones Julian had protected so fiercely, they weren't just any children. They were his own flesh and blood. The family he had ruthlessly, blindly thrown into the freezing rain. Arthur lunged for his desk phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely punch the buttons. "Jackson," he roared into the receiver, not caring that it was 3 in the morning. "I want every hotel, every motel, every single temporary residence in Lumina City scoured. I want the passenger manifests of every train that arrived today. Find a man traveling with 5 young children. Do whatever it takes. Spare no expense. Bring him to me." Miles away, oblivious to the storm brewing in the corporate district, I was standing in the cavernous, brilliantly lit main hall of the National Culinary Expo. The sheer scale of the event was terrifying. Hundreds of elite chefs, master bakers, and ruthless investors roamed the aisles. The air was thick with the scent of exotic spices, rich chocolates, and roasting meats, a chaotic symphony of culinary ambition. I adjusted the collar of my pristine white chef's coat, my hands incredibly steady despite the anxiety gnawing at the edges of my mind. I had left the children safely tucked away in our secure hotel suite under the incredibly watchful eye of Mrs. Higgins, my trusted, fiercely loyal elderly bakery manager who had traveled with us. I had strictly forbidden them from leaving the room. The expo floor was too public, too exposed. I could not risk Arthur or Elias spotting them again. Above my meticulously arranged booth, a sleek, modern sign read, "The Silent Haven Coastal Artisanal Pastries." I took a deep, calming breath, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second. I am Rin. I am a master baker. I am a father. I am not a victim anymore. The expo officially opened, and the rush was instantaneous. People flocked to my booth, drawn by the unique, rustic aesthetic of my displays. I moved with a silent, practiced grace, offering delicate, bite-sized samples of my signature creations. My inability to speak was no longer a crutch. It had become an enigmatic, charming part of my brand. I communicated through warm smiles, polite bows, and small, beautifully handwritten cards detailing the ingredients of each pastry. Hours blurred into a frantic, exhausting rhythm of serving, smiling, and restocking. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several prominent investors had already left their business cards on my counter. Victory, and the financial security of my 5 beautiful pups, was entirely within my grasp. Suddenly, a noticeable, profound hush fell over the immediate area. The chaotic chatter of the crowd parted like the Red Sea. The temperature in the massive hall seemed to drop a few degrees, replaced by the heavy, suffocating, undeniable aura of a dominant, extremely powerful alpha. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. My Omega instincts, deeply buried but never truly extinguished, screamed a terrifying warning, sending a violent shiver down my spine. My hands, which had been so steady all morning, completely froze in the middle of arranging a tray of tarts. "Move out of the way, please. Arthur Hayes coming through. The VIP sponsor needs to inspect this aisle," a booming, authoritative voice announced. I kept my head down, my heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs. I pulled my white chef's hat lower over my brow and adjusted the black surgical mask covering the lower half of my face, a standard hygiene practice in the culinary world that was currently serving as my only physical shield. Through my peripheral vision, I saw the polished, incredibly expensive Italian leather shoes step up directly to the counter of the Silent Haven. "Oh, look at this rustic little setup, Arthur," came the sickeningly sweet, familiar, venomous drawl. Elias. He was clinging tightly to Arthur's arm, eyeing my display with a condescending, arrogant sneer. It looked so incredibly quaint, almost pitiful compared to the French pâtisseries we saw earlier. "I doubt anything here is fit for your palate, darling." I gripped the edge of the stainless steel counter beneath the display case, my knuckles turning entirely white. The sheer, overwhelming urge to leap over the counter and strangle the Omega who had destroyed my life was a physical, burning ache in my muscles. But I forced myself to remain perfectly, absolutely still. I was a statue. Arthur didn't reply to Elias. Instead, his piercing, icy blue eyes scanned the handwritten ingredient cards. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with a strange, dark tension that hadn't been there 5 years ago. "I will try this one," Arthur finally spoke, his deep baritone vibrating through the air and settling directly into the marrow of my bones. He pointed a long, elegant finger at the center of the display. My breath completely stopped. He was pointing at the moonlight tart. It was a delicate, intricate pastry filled with a very specific, incredibly rare blend of Tahiti and vanilla bean custard, a hint of dark sea salt, and a deeply caramelized sugar crust. It was the exact, precise recipe I had spent 3 weeks perfecting for Arthur's private birthday dinner during our first year of marriage. It was the pastry that used to make him smile, the one he claimed tasted like home. I had placed it on the menu today as a silent, painful tribute to the ghosts I was trying to bury. With trembling, gloved hands, I used a pair of silver tongs to delicately place the small tart onto a pristine porcelain tasting plate. I slid it across the glass counter, keeping my head bowed, completely refusing to make eye contact. Elias rolled his eyes dramatically. "Honestly, Arthur, it's just a common tart. Don't waste your calories." Arthur completely ignored him. He picked up the small, ornate silver fork provided on the plate. He cut a small piece of the tart, the caramelized crust breaking with a satisfying, sharp crack. He raised the fork to his lips and took a bite. Time seemed to entirely freeze in the bustling exhibition hall. The ambient noise of 1,000 conversations faded into absolute, dead silence in my ears. I watched his throat swallow. Arthur completely froze. The fork slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the porcelain plate. His broad shoulders went completely rigid. All the color rapidly drained from his aristocratic face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. His icy blue eyes widened impossibly, a terrifying storm of shock, disbelief, and a decade's worth of agonizing, crushing nostalgia violently erupting within them. The taste was undeniable. It was a culinary fingerprint. It was a flavor profile impossible to replicate by mere coincidence. It was the exact taste of the love he had thrown away. "Who?" Arthur choked out, his voice a ragged, desperate whisper that sounded as if it were being violently torn from his throat. He slapped his large hands down flat onto the glass display counter, his knuckles turning white. His alpha aura exploded outward, raw and untamed, causing several people nearby to physically stumble backward. "Who made this?" Elias jumped, visibly terrified by Arthur's sudden, explosive reaction. "Arthur, what's wrong with you? It's just sugar." "Shut up, Elias," Arthur roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the booth. He didn't look at his companion. His desperate, wild eyes remained locked onto my bowed head. He leaned entirely over the counter, invading my space, the scent of cedarwood and winter air crashing into my senses. "I asked a question," Arthur growled, his voice dropping into a lethal, incredibly dangerous register. "Who baked this tart? Bring out the master baker. Right now." My chest heaved. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The exit was blocked by his security detail, and backing away would only draw more suspicion. The moment I had dreaded, the terrifying confrontation I had lost countless nights of sleep over, had arrived in the middle of a crowded, brilliantly lit room. I slowly released my death grip on the steel counter below. I took a deep, fortifying breath, channeling the fierce, unyielding strength of my 5 children waiting for me back at the hotel. I was no longer the boy who cried on the floor. I was the master of the silent haven. I slowly lifted my head. I reached up with a steady hand, grabbed the elastic loops of the black surgical mask, and pulled it down, completely exposing my face to the harsh, unforgiving light. I looked directly, unflinchingly into Arthur Hayes's eyes. The silence that stretched between us was louder than a bomb detonating. I saw the exact, precise moment Arthur's universe completely shattered. His lips parted in a silent gasp. His icy blue eyes flooded with an instantaneous, overwhelming tsunami of tears, his pupils dilating wildly. The ruthless billionaire, the man who controlled half the city, looked as though he had just been shot directly through the heart. He looked at my face, my lips, the defiant, cold anger burning in my eyes, and he stopped breathing entirely. Julian. Arthur breathed out, the name slipping past his lips like a prayer and a curse all at once. He reached his trembling hand across the glass, his fingers desperately reaching toward my face, practically begging for a single touch to prove I wasn't an illusion. You're alive. You're here. Elias gasped loudly from behind him, stepping forward to look at my face. The sheer, unadulterated horror that twisted Elias's flawless features was a sight that brought a dark, vengeful satisfaction to my soul. And no, Elias stammered, stumbling backward, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. That's impossible. You're gone. I didn't look at Elias. I kept my cold, unwavering gaze locked entirely on Arthur. I didn't reach out to meet his trembling hand. I didn't smile. I simply stood there, an immovable mountain of cold, silent defiance. Arthur's hand fell short of my cheek, resting helplessly against the cold glass of the display case. A single, heavy tear broke free from his eye and rolled down his cheek. Julian, Arthur begged, his voice breaking into a million pathetic pieces, entirely ignoring the hundreds of people actively staring and whispering around us. Please, talk to me. Say something. Anything. I stared at him for one more agonizing second, letting the immense, crushing weight of my permanent silence serve as the ultimate, unforgiving answer to his plea. Then, with calculated, deliberate slowness, I reached under the counter, pulled out a small, blank whiteboard and a black marker. I wrote a single, sharp sentence, flipped the board over, and slammed it down onto the glass counter directly over his trembling hand. The bold, black letters stared back at him like a death sentence. My name is Run, and you are blocking my customers. End of Part 3. Part 4. The Weight of the Crown. The brutal, unapologetic words written in thick black ink on the small whiteboard hung in the air like an executioner's blade. My name is Run, and you are blocking my customers. Arthur stared down at the board, his broad chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow gasps. The ruthless billionaire, a man who had mercilessly dismantled rival corporations without blinking, was entirely paralyzed by a piece of cheap plastic and a single sentence. His hands, still resting on the cold glass of the display case, were shaking so violently that the entire counter rattled. The silence in the grand exhibition hall had reached a fever pitch. Hundreds of eyes were entirely glued to our booth. The elite investors, the rival chefs, the wealthy patrons. Everyone was holding their breath, watching the untouchable Arthur Hayes absolutely shatter in the middle of the culinary expo. Julian. Arthur choked out again, completely ignoring my written warning. He completely ignored the crowd. He completely ignored the fact that his reputation was unraveling in real time. He pressed his face closer to the glass barrier separating us, his icy blue eyes pleading, swimming with a decade's worth of unshed tears. Julian, please. I know it's you. Your eyes, your scar, the taste of this tart. Please, just speak to me. Just one word. Let me hear you. I stared at him, my expression a flawless, impenetrable mask of absolute ice. I didn't flinch. I didn't soften. He was begging for my voice, completely forgetting that he was the very man who had violently swatted my hands away when I had desperately tried to communicate my innocence 5 years ago. He had demanded my silence then. Now he would drown in it. I calmly reached out, picked up the whiteboard eraser, and slowly, deliberately wiped my previous message away. I picked up the black marker. The squeak of the felt tip against the board was the only sound in our immediate vicinity. I wrote a new sentence, flipped the board, and set it down. I am not the ghost you are looking for. Security has been called. Arthur read the words, and a ragged, wet sound, half sob, half growl, tore from his throat. No, no, I am not leaving. I am not letting you disappear again. He suddenly reached over the high glass counter, his long arms attempting to grab my wrist, desperate for a physical anchor to prove this wasn't a hallucination. Instinct took over. The second his fingers brushed the sleeve of my white chef's coat, I violently recoiled, as if I had been burned by hot iron. I took 3 rapid steps back, my back hitting the stainless steel ovens behind me. A look of pure, unadulterated aversion flashed across my face. I looked at his outstretched hand with absolute disgust. Arthur completely froze, his arms suspended in midair. The physical rejection hit him harder than a bullet. The realization that his touch, the touch I used to crave, the touch I used to lean into, now physically repulsed me, made the color drain entirely from his face. Arthur, stop this madness right now. Elias suddenly shrieked, entirely unable to handle the complete destruction of his carefully curated public image. He grabbed Arthur's arm, his perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of Arthur's suit. You are making a massive scene. The press is here. Stop making a fool of yourself over this. This mute baker. He isn't Julian. Julian is dead. Arthur slowly turned his head to look at Elias. The sheer, terrifying lethality in Arthur's icy blue eyes made the entire crowd instinctively take a collective step backward. The devastating grief that had just crippled him was instantaneously replaced by a monstrous, towering, violently explosive rage. Take your hands off me, Arthur growled, his voice dropping an entire octave, vibrating with an alpha command so powerful that several Omegas in the crowd whimpered. Elias instantly let go, stumbling backward in absolute terror, his flawless face turning stark white. He had never, in 5 years, heard Arthur use that tone with him. If you ever, Arthur stepped toward Elias, completely towering over the trembling Omega. Ever speak his name again, if you ever disrespect him in my presence again, I will personally destroy your entire bloodline. You will have nothing. Do you understand me? Elias couldn't even form a word. He just nodded frantically, tears of absolute humiliation and fear ruining his expensive makeup. He turned and practically ran through the crowd, fleeing the expo hall in utter disgrace. Before Arthur could turn back to my booth, for heavily armed private security guards for the expo finally pushed through the gawking crowd. Mr. Hayes, the head of security said, his tone incredibly respectful but firm. Sir, you are causing a major disruption. We have to ask you to clear the aisle. The vendor has requested space. Arthur looked at the guards, then slowly turned his agonizing gaze back to me. I was still pressed against the ovens, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, my face hidden once again by the cold, emotionless shield of my dark sunglasses and my pulled-up mask. He knew he couldn't force me. Not here. Not with the press watching. He had already lost me once. Creating a violent scene would only push me further into the shadows. I will find you, Arthur whispered, the words carrying across the counter, meant only for my ears. It wasn't a threat. It was a desperate, unbreakable vow. I will tear the universe apart to fix this, Julian. I swear it on my life. He slowly backed away, never once taking his eyes off my masked face, until the sea of people swallowed him whole. The moment he was out of sight, my legs completely gave out. I sank to the floor behind the counter, my back sliding down the cold steel of the oven. I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in my arms as violent, silent tremors racked my entire body. I couldn't breathe. The ghost of his cedarwood scent still lingered heavily in the air, suffocating me, dragging me back to the darkest, most agonizing night of my existence. But I didn't have the luxury of breaking down. I wasn't just Julian, the discarded mate, anymore. I was Ruin, the father of 5. I forced myself to stand up. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, adjusted my uniform, and plastered on a polite, professional smile. For the next 3 hours, I ran purely on adrenaline and sheer, unmatched willpower. I served the remaining pastries. I shook hands with investors. And miraculously, amid the chaos, I signed a massive, life-changing distribution contract with the largest high-end grocery chain in the country. The second the ink was dry on the contract, I packed my knives, grabbed my coat, and fled the exhibition center as if the devil himself was on my heels. The interior of the Hayes Corporation limousine was as silent as a tomb. Arthur sat in the back, entirely engulfed in shadows, a crystal glass of untouched amber whiskey resting on his knee. His mind was a chaotic, violent storm of shattered memories and impossible revelations. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. He opened the hidden photo gallery he had kept securely locked away for 5 years. It was the only picture of Julian he had allowed himself to keep. A candid shot of Julian asleep in their massive bed, his soft face buried in the pillows, looking so incredibly peaceful. Arthur stared at the photo, a single tear cutting a hot path down his cheek. I destroyed you, he thought, the guilt gnawing at his vital organs like a starving animal. I threw you to the wolves because I was too blind, too arrogant to see the truth. And you survived. You became a king in your own right. The partition window suddenly slid down. Jackson, Arthur's massive, fiercely loyal head of security, handed a thick manila folder through the gap. "Sir," Jackson said, his usually stoic voice laced with a profound, heavy hesitation. "I deployed the entire team. We pulled the expo registration details. We cross-referenced the vendor name, Run, with the footage from the train station yesterday." Arthur snatched the folder, his hands trembling as he flipped it open. "His legal name is Run Nightfall," Jackson reported, watching his boss carefully in the rearview mirror. "He legally changed his name and heavily altered his social security records 5 years ago, exactly 3 weeks after your divorce was finalized. He currently resides in a small coastal town 300 miles from here. He owns a highly successful bakery called the Silent Haven." Arthur devoured the printed pages, his eyes scanning the incredibly detailed background check. But there was a second, smaller folder tucked inside the main one. It was labeled Dependents. Arthur's heart completely stopped. The air vanished from the limousine. "Jackson," Arthur whispered, his fingers hovering over the seal of the smaller folder. "The children at the station, the 5 boys. Who are they?" Jackson swallowed hard, looking away from the mirror. "Sir, I accessed the town's medical records. Rin Nightfall is listed as the sole parent and legal guardian of 5 children. Quintuplets. Born entirely healthy, despite extreme medical odds." Arthur ripped the folder open. 5 incredibly crisp, clear photographs spilled onto the leather seat next to him. School portraits. 5 little boys with bright, innocent smiles. Arthur picked up the first photograph. The boy had soft, messy brown hair, exactly like Julian's, but his eyes were piercing, intelligent, icy blue. They were the exact, undeniable mirror image of Arthur's own eyes. Arthur's breath hitched violently. He picked up the next photo. And the next. 5 beautiful, healthy, vibrant children. He flipped one of the medical certificates over, his eyes frantically searching for the date of birth. Date of birth, October 14th. Arthur dropped the papers. His hands flew to his mouth to muffle the agonizing, gut-wrenching sob that violently tore its way out of his throat. October 14th. Exactly 7 months after he had thrown Julian out into the freezing rain. I was pregnant. The realization was a nuclear bomb detonating directly inside his brain. Julian hadn't just been an innocent Omega thrown away by a cruel Alpha. Julian had been carrying Arthur's pups. 5 of them. When Arthur threw the divorce papers at him, when Arthur told him he was nothing but a pathetic charity project, Julian had been hiding the greatest miracle of their lives beneath his clothes. He had walked out into the freezing storm, entirely alone, completely penniless, entirely mute, carrying 5 of Arthur's children. And he had raised them on his own. He had protected them. He had loved them while the man who fathered them was living in a penthouse with the Omega who ruined their lives. God! Arthur wept openly, completely breaking down in the back of the limousine, his broad shoulders shaking with an agony so profound it felt like he was physically dying. He gathered the 5 photographs, pressing them against his chest, right over his violently breaking heart. "What have I done? Julian, my God, what have I done to you?" "Sir," Jackson interrupted softly, deeply disturbed by the absolute destruction of the most powerful man he knew. "We also tracked his current location. He isn't staying at the Expo housing. He rented a private, high-security suite at the Grand Lumina Hotel." Arthur's head snapped up, his wet blue eyes suddenly flashing with a desperate, unyielding, absolute resolve. "Turn the car around. Get me to the Grand Lumina. Right now." The hotel suite was warm, filled with the soft, comforting glow of the lamps and the beautiful, chaotic sound of my 5 children. We had ordered room service, and they were currently sitting on the massive carpeted floor, eating French fries and arguing over a cartoon playing on the giant television. I sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, a cup of hot chamomile tea trembling in my hands. The massive contract was sitting on the coffee table, a physical proof of my absolute victory, but I couldn't celebrate. The ghost of Arthur's desperate, pleading eyes was entirely burned into the back of my eyelids. He had found me. The wall I had spent 5 years meticulously building had a massive, glaring crack in it. "Papa," Leo's quiet, incredibly observant voice pulled me from my dark thoughts. He was standing next to the sofa, holding a heavily battered stuffed wolf. His icy blue eyes, Arthur's eyes, were staring right through my soul. "You are sad." Your scent is sour, like burnt sugar. I forced a gentle, reassuring smile. I placed my tea down and pulled my eldest son into my lap, burying my nose in his soft hair. Papa is just very tired from the expo, my brave little wolf. I signed carefully, ensuring he could read my hands. But I have very good news. We are going home tomorrow, early in the morning. Home, Finn yelled from the floor, throwing a fry at Felix. I miss my bed, and the bakery smells better than this city. I kissed the top of Leo's head, the fierce, burning need to protect them overwhelming every other emotion. We would leave at dawn, before Arthur could mobilize his immense resources, before he could drag me into a brutal, horrifying custody battle. I would disappear into the wind once again. Knock, knock, knock. The heavy, authoritative knocks against the thick mahogany door of the suite echoed through the room like gunshots. My blood instantly turned to liquid nitrogen. The children immediately went dead silent, their little heads snapping toward the entryway. Mrs. Higgins, who had been reading a magazine in the armchair, slowly stood up, looking at me with deep concern. "Room service, perhaps?" Mrs. Higgins whispered, though we hadn't ordered anything else. I didn't answer. Every primal, deeply buried Omega instinct in my body was suddenly screaming a deafening, terrifying warning. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy, saturated with a thick, suffocating tension that seeped right under the crack of the door. I gently set Leo down on the sofa. I raised my hands, my face incredibly serious. "Stay here. Do not move. Do not make a sound." I walked slowly toward the entryway, my legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. The hallway outside was silent. I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the small brass peephole. My heart completely stopped. Standing in the opulent, dimly lit hallway of the hotel, completely alone, looking utterly, entirely destroyed, was Arthur. He wasn't wearing his expensive suit jacket anymore. His tie was gone, his crisp white shirt was heavily wrinkled, and his hair was an absolute, chaotic mess. He looked like a man who had just walked through a literal war zone and barely survived. Panic, thick and suffocating, violently seized my throat. He found us. He actually found us. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving. I looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything. But we were entirely trapped on the 20th floor. "Julian," Arthur's voice suddenly filtered through the heavy wood. It wasn't a booming, alpha command. It was a broken, desperate, pathetic whisper that carried a lifetime of regret. "Julian, please. I know you're in there. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm entirely alone." I told my security to wait outside the building. "Please, just open the door." I clamped my hands over my mouth to completely stifle the panicked gasp that tried to escape. I shook my head violently, even though he couldn't see me. "Go away." My mind screamed. "Leave us alone. You have no right." "Papa," Milo whispered fearfully, clutching his twin brother's hand tightly. "Who is at the door?" "I saw the files, Julian," Arthur's voice cracked, sounding as though he was pressing his forehead directly against the wood of the door. "I saw the birth certificates. October 14th. You were pregnant when I forced you out. You were carrying my children. Our children." A loud, agonizing sob echoed from the hallway, a sound so entirely foreign, so incredibly broken coming from the untouchable Arthur Hayes, that it sent a violent shiver down my spine. "I am so incredibly sorry," Arthur wept, completely surrendering his pride, his dominance, his entire ego to the cold hotel door. "I was a monster. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I believed a lie because I was terrified of losing the Empire, and instead, I lost my entire world. Please, Julian, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Punish me. Hate me. Stab me if you have to. But please, let me see them. Let me see my pups. Just for 1 minute." The sheer, raw desperation in his voice was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I looked back at the living room. 5 little boys were huddled together on the carpet, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, completely unaware that the monster of my past, the father who threw them away before they were even born, was weeping on the other side of the door. Leo, my brave, incredibly perceptive firstborn, slowly stood up from the sofa. He walked toward me, his little fists clenched tightly at his sides. He looked at the heavy door, then looked up at my terrified face. "Is it the mean man from the station, Papa?" Leo asked quietly, his icy blue eyes, Arthur's eyes, flashing with a fierce, protective anger that belonged entirely to an alpha. "Is he trying to hurt you again?" Before I could stop him, before I could grab his little arm and pull him back, Leo reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the door. With a surprising amount of strength, he pulled it downward and yanked the heavy door open. The barrier was gone. Arthur was kneeling on the carpeted floor of the hallway, his face buried in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. At the sound of the door opening, his head snapped up. The breath violently left Arthur's lungs. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking entirely, directly at the tiny, fiercely glaring boy standing right in front of him. He was looking directly into his own icy blue eyes, staring back at him from the face of a 5-year-old child. Time entirely stopped. Slowly, Arthur's gaze drifted past Leo. He looked into the warm, brightly lit living room. He saw Finn and Felix, clutching each other on the floor. He saw Milo hiding behind Mrs. Higgins' leg. He saw little Jasper, holding a half-eaten French fry, staring at him with wide, innocent eyes. Five beautiful, living, breathing pieces of his own soul that he had never known existed until today. Arthur let out a sound that wasn't human. It was the agonizing, beautifully tragic wail of an alpha finally finding his lost pack. He didn't stand up. He couldn't. He simply slumped forward onto the threshold of the hotel room door, pressing his forehead against the carpet directly at Leo's small feet, absolutely, entirely broken. "My pups," Arthur whispered into the floor, his tears soaking the expensive hotel carpet. "My beautiful, perfect pups. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I stood entirely frozen above him, the wall I had built for 5 years violently shattering into a million irreversible pieces. The ghosts of Lumina City had finally caught up to us, and there was nowhere left to run. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Ashes of an Empire. The hallway of the Grand Lumina Hotel was completely dead and silent, save for the agonizing, guttural sounds of a broken billionaire weeping against the plush carpet. Arthur Hayes, a man whose mere name could cause the stock market to tremble, was currently reduced to nothing but a shattered, desperate shell, his forehead resting inches away from the small, brightly colored sneakers of his 5-year-old son. Time hung suspended in the air, thick and suffocating. Leo stood in the doorway, his tiny posture incredibly rigid. His icy blue eyes, an exact, undeniable miniature replica of the ones currently spilling hot tears onto the floor, stared down at the grown alpha with a mixture of profound confusion and fierce, unyielding defiance. He didn't know this man. He only knew that this was the same stranger from the train station who had made his papa smell like pure, terrifying panic. "Papa," Leo's small, clear voice finally broke the suffocating silence. He didn't take a single step backward. Instead, he planted his feet firmly on the threshold, his tiny fists still clenched. "Why is the mean man crying on our floor? Tell him to go away." Those words, spoken with the absolute, innocent cruelty of a child protecting his parent, hit Arthur with the kinetic force of a speeding train. A sharp, physical gasp tore from Arthur's throat. He slowly, agonizingly lifted his head from the carpet. His face was a devastating portrait of absolute ruin. His aristocratic features blotchy, his eyes completely bloodshot, his jaw trembling violently as he looked up at the boy he had thrown away before he was even born. Arthur choked out, his voice a ragged, raw whisper. He raised a violently shaking hand, his fingers desperately curling in the air, aching to touch his son's cheek, just to feel the warmth of his own flesh and blood. I'm not a mean man, little one. I am so sorry." The second Arthur's hand moved toward Leo, the paralysis that had completely gripped my body instantly incinerated. A primal, ferocious Omega instinct, a dark, violent need to protect my pups at absolutely any cost, exploded in my chest. I moved faster than conscious thought. I lunged forward, grabbing Leo by his small shoulders and violently yanking him backward, entirely out of Arthur's reach. I stepped directly into the center of the doorway, using my own body as an impenetrable physical shield. I glared down at Arthur, my chest heaving with explosive, unadulterated rage. If looks could physically kill, Arthur Hayes would have been reduced to absolute ash on the hotel carpet. I pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at his face, then aggressively pointed down the long, empty corridor. "Leave." My silent scream echoed in the absolute fury of my dark eyes. "Get away from my children." Arthur stared up at me, the devastating reality of my absolute hatred freezing the blood in his veins. He didn't try to stand up. He remained on his knees, completely surrendering every ounce of his alpha dominance, his pride, and his ego. He placed both of his large hands flat on the floor in front of me, bowing his head in the ultimate, most degrading posture of absolute submission. "Julian, please," Arthur begged, his broad shoulders shaking with fresh, violent sobs. "I am begging you. I will give you everything. I will sign over the entire Hayes Corporation to you right now. I will empty every bank account. I will walk into the ocean if you ask me to. Just, please don't shut the door on me again. Please don't take them away from me." The sheer, monumental audacity of his plea made my blood boil with a toxic, burning venom. He thought he could buy his way back into my life. He thought the billions he had amassed while I was starving in a freezing, drafty apartment, rationing bread just to produce enough milk for his 5 children, could somehow erase the agonizing scars on my soul. I turned my head slightly. Mrs. Higgins was standing near the sofa, her face pale with shock. I signaled her quickly with my hands. Take the children into the bedroom. Now, lock the door. Mrs. Higgins didn't hesitate. Come along, boys, she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic scene. She ushered Finn, Felix, Milo, and Jasper toward the adjoining suite bedroom. But Papa, Finn protested, looking back at me with wide, frightened eyes. Papa is fine, sweetie. Mrs. Higgins urged them forward. Leo was the last to go, his icy blue eyes glaring at Arthur one last time before the heavy wooden door of the bedroom clicked entirely shut, locking the children safely away from the monster in the hallway. Once I was entirely certain they were safe, I turned my full, devastating attention back to Arthur. I reached into the pocket of my coat, hanging near the door, and pulled out the small notepad and pen I always carried. My hand was shaking with pure, unadulterated fury as I pressed the pen into the paper. I wrote a single paragraph, my handwriting sharp, jagged, and violent. I tore the page out and threw it directly into Arthur's weeping face. It fluttered to the carpet, landing right between his hands. Arthur scrambled to pick it up, his breath hitching as he read the words through his tears. You do not have the right to look at them. You do not have the right to weep for them. You made your choice 5 years ago when you looked me in the eyes and called me a pathetic charity project. You threw us into the freezing rain for a lie. My children do not have a father. They only have a ghost. Get off your knees and get out of my sight before I call the police. Arthur read the note, and a fresh wave of absolute, crippling agony washed over his face. He clutched the piece of paper to his chest as if it were a holy relic, completely uncaring that it was soaked with his own tears. I know I was a monster, Arthur whispered, his voice completely raw, his icy blue eyes desperately seeking mine. I know I destroyed the only pure, beautiful thing I ever had. Julian, I saw the security footage. The unedited footage from the downtown cafe. I saw Damien grab you. I saw you fight him off and run away terrified. I know you were entirely innocent. I know Elias manipulated the angle, and I was too blinded by the stress of the corporate war to see the absolute truth. I stared at him, my expression an unyielding, frozen mask of absolute ice. But inside, my heart violently clenched. He knew. He finally knew the truth. But the revelation didn't bring me peace. It didn't wash away the pain. Instead, it ignited a brand new, scorching inferno of bitter resentment. I grabbed the notepad again, pressing the pen so hard against the paper that it nearly tore through to the next page. I shoved the new note aggressively against his chest, forcing him to take it. So you needed high-definition video footage to believe your own husband? My desperate tears, my frantic signing, my 3 years of absolute, unquestioning devotion to you weren't enough? You needed a camera to prove I wasn't a whore. That makes it worse, Arthur. It means your love was always entirely conditional. Arthur read the words, and it was as if I had taken a physical blade and plunged it directly into his heart. He gasped, falling back slightly onto his heels, completely destroyed by the absolute, undeniable truth of my accusation. You're right, Arthur choked out, the devastating realization finally breaking the last remaining pieces of his fractured soul. You're entirely right. I didn't trust you. I let my own deep-seated insecurities, my own toxic paranoia, completely blind me. I didn't protect you. I failed you in every single conceivable way an alpha can fail his omega. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, hollow, and utterly defeated. The untouchable billionaire was dead. In his place was a man actively bleeding out from his own fatal mistakes. I ruined Elias, Arthur suddenly confessed, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying, incredibly lethal register that sent a shiver down my spine. The day I found out the truth, I completely dismantled his life. I stripped him of his wealth, his reputation, his family's standing. He has absolutely nothing left in this world. I made sure he will suffer for the rest of his miserable existence for what he did to us. I looked at him with absolute disgust. Did he truly think destroying Elias would magically glue my shattered heart back together? Did he think a corporate vendetta could erase the 5 years of agonizing, silent pain I endured while raising quintuplets in extreme poverty? I stepped back, my hand firmly gripping the brass handle of the hotel door. I was entirely done with this conversation. I was done with him. I raised my free hand, moving my fingers in slow, deliberate, incredibly sharp signs. I knew he still remembered the language. I knew he could read my hands. Your revenge means absolutely nothing to me. I signed, my dark eyes completely hollow. You are entirely dead to me, Arthur Hayes. Do not follow us. Do not send your lawyers. If you ever try to take my children from me, I will completely destroy you. I will go to the press. I will ruin your entire empire. Leave us alone. I began to swing the heavy door shut. Wait! Arthur desperately lunged forward, his large hand catching the edge of the heavy wood, completely preventing it from closing. He didn't try to push his way in, but his grip was unyielding. Julian, please. Just answer one question. Just one, and I swear on my life I will walk away tonight. I stopped pulling on the door, my chest heaving, glaring at him through the small gap. Arthur's icy blue eyes were entirely focused on my face, burning with a frantic, desperate need. The boy who opened the door. Leo. And the other four. Finn, Felix, Milo, Jasper. He had already memorized their names from the medical files. His voice completely broke as he spoke them aloud. Do they know about me? Do they know who I am? The sheer vulnerability in his question was almost suffocating. He was terrified. The most powerful man in the city was terrified that his own children hated him. I stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. I thought about the countless nights Leo had asked why they didn't have an alpha in the house. I thought about the times I had held back my bitter tears, completely refusing to poison their innocent minds with the monstrous reality of their father's betrayal. I reached for my notepad one last time. I wrote a single, devastating sentence, shoved it through the crack in the door, and then violently slammed the heavy wood completely shut, the lock clicking into place with a definitive, absolute finality. Arthur remained kneeling in the empty, silent hallway. He slowly unfolded the piece of paper, his hands trembling so violently he could barely focus his blurred vision on the ink. They do not know you exist. To them, their father died a hero before they were born. Do not dare ruin the only good thing I ever gave them. A guttural, agonizing scream of pure, unadulterated devastation violently tore from Arthur's throat, echoing through the empty, opulent corridors of the Grand Lumina Hotel. He collapsed entirely onto the floor, curling his massive frame into a tight ball against the locked door of my suite, weeping for the ghost he had become and the beautiful, impossible family he had violently thrown away. Inside the room, I slid down the back of the door until I hit the floor, burying my face in my knees as silent, body-racking tears finally broke through my cold facade. We had survived the night. But as I listened to the muffled, agonizing sounds of my former mate breaking into a million pieces on the other side of the wood, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that this war was far from over. Arthur Hayes had finally found his pack, and an alpha, no matter how broken, never truly stops hunting for what belongs to him. End of Part 5. Part 6. The Shadow of the Alpha. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed with a harsh, unforgiving red light. 3:14 a.m. I sat rigidly on the edge of the massive king-sized bed in the master bedroom of the hotel suite, staring blindly into the darkness. The luxurious silence of the room was completely shattered by the erratic, deafening pounding of my own heart. I hadn't slept a single second. Every time I closed my eyes, the horrific, devastating image of Arthur Hayes, the ruthless, untouchable billionaire who had once been my entire universe, weeping uncontrollably on the carpet outside our door violently flashed through my mind. I carefully stood up, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. I walked over to the massive, tangled pile of blankets on the floor where my 5 miracles were currently fast asleep. Finn had his arm thrown over Felix's face. Milo was curled into a tiny ball holding Jasper's hand, and Leo, my fierce, perceptive firstborn, was sleeping entirely on his back, his brow slightly furrowed even in his dreams. I knelt down, the faint scent of baby shampoo and warm milk immediately soothing the violent anxiety tearing at my chest. I have to get them out of here, I thought, a cold, calculated survival instinct completely overriding my exhaustion. If the sun rises, Arthur will mobilize his entire empire. He will have an army of lawyers, private investigators, and security guards surrounding this hotel. We have to vanish into the night. I moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of a parent who had spent 5 years constantly looking over his shoulder. I tapped Mrs. Higgins on the shoulder. She had been dozing in the armchair, fully dressed, completely aware of the terrifying stakes. She nodded silently, instantly understanding the unspoken command in my dark eyes. Within exactly 20 minutes, our bags were packed. The massive distribution contract from the Culinary Expo, the physical proof of my absolute victory over my past, was secured deeply inside my coat pocket. Waking the quintuplets was an agonizing task. They were groggy, confused, and whiny. "Papa, it's dark outside," Jasper whimpered, rubbing his sleepy eyes as I shoved his little arms into his winter coat. "Where are we going?" I knelt down, offering him a gentle, completely fabricated smile. I raised my hands, ensuring he could see them in the dim light of the hallway. "We are going on a secret adventure, my little star. We have to sneak out very quietly, so the monsters don't hear us." That instantly captured their attention. To them, it was a thrilling game. To me, it was a desperate, terrifying race for our absolute survival. I didn't dare go near the main door of the suite. The thought of Arthur still being out there, completely broken and desperate, made my stomach violently churn. Instead, I ushered Mrs. Higgins and the 5 boys toward the service exit at the back of the hallway, a route I had memorized on our first day here just in case of an emergency. We slipped into the cold, metallic service elevator. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, effectively cutting us off from the 20th floor, I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for an entire decade. We exited through the loading dock of the Grand Lumina Hotel, bypassing the extravagant marble lobby entirely. A private, heavily tinted transport van I had booked 30 minutes ago was already idling in the freezing, rain-slicked alleyway. The driver, a discreet man who had been paid handsomely for his silence and speed, quickly loaded our luggage. I ushered the kids inside, buckling them into the wide leather seats. The moment the van's doors slammed shut and the engine roared to life, I finally collapsed into the passenger seat, my entire body violently shaking from the adrenaline crash. As the van sped through the dark, neon-lit streets of Lumina City, actively putting miles between us and the epicenter of my deepest trauma, Leo unbuckled his seatbelt and crawled forward, resting his little chin on the back of my seat. "Papa," Leo whispered into the dark cabin, his icy blue eyes completely alert, staring intensely into the rearview mirror to catch my reflection. "Is the mean crying man still at the hotel?" My heart violently seized. I turned around in my seat, looking at the exact, miniature replica of Arthur's face. "He is gone, Leo." I signed slowly, my hands trembling slightly despite my desperate attempt to control them. "You do not ever have to worry about him again. He was just a stranger who was very sad." Leo frowned, his sharp, analytical mind clearly not entirely convinced by my lie. "His eyes look like my eyes, Papa. And he smelled like the forest when it rains. Like cedarwood." The breath was violently punched from my lungs. I stared at my 5-year-old son in absolute horror. He hadn't just noticed the physical resemblance. His dormant alpha instincts had actively recognized and categorized his own father's scent. The biological bond between them, a bond one had fiercely tried to completely sever and erase, was entirely undeniable. I reached back and gently brushed Leo's messy brown hair from his forehead. I forced a reassuring, soft smile that didn't reach my terrified eyes. "It was just a coincidence, my brave wolf. Now go to sleep. When you wake up, we will be home, and you can smell the ocean again." Leo reluctantly nodded, crawling back to his seat and curling up next to Finn. I turned back to face the dark highway, pressing my forehead against the freezing glass of the window. The reflection staring back at me was a man actively drowning in a sea of secrets. I had won the battle tonight. I had successfully escaped. But as I watched the towering, glittering skyscrapers of Lumina City fade entirely into the distance, I knew with a terrifying, absolute certainty that Arthur Hayes was not the type of alpha to simply surrender to the shadows. The morning sun had barely begun to paint the Lumina City skyline in hues of pale gold and bruised purple when Arthur Hayes finally moved. He was entirely numb. The freezing chill of the hotel hallway had completely seeped into his bones, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the absolute, freezing void that had violently consumed his chest. He was still sitting on the carpet, his back pressed heavily against the mahogany door of room 2014, his long legs stretched out in front of him. His expensive, custom-tailored shirt was entirely ruined, wrinkled, and stained with hours of agonizing tears. He held the crumpled, tear-soaked note Julian had shoved under the door in his large, shaking hands. "They do not know you exist. To them, their father died a hero before they were born." Those 2 sentences were a psychological execution. They were the absolute, ultimate punishment for a man whose entire life was built on legacy, bloodline, and absolute control. Julian hadn't just taken his children. He had entirely rewritten history, actively completely erasing Arthur from their existence to protect them from the monster he had been. The heavy thud of combat boots violently shattered the suffocating silence of the corridor. Jackson, Arthur's massive, imposing head of security, rounded the corner. He stopped dead in his tracks, his stoic face contorting in absolute shock at the pathetic, entirely broken sight of his billionaire boss sitting on the floor like a discarded beggar. "Sir," Jackson said, his voice unusually soft, entirely lacking its usual military bark. I spoke to the hotel management. They checked the room's security logs. Jackson swallowed hard, hating the devastating news he was about to deliver. The electronic lock on the door was disengaged from the inside at 3:35 a.m. The service elevator was utilized. They are entirely gone, Mr. Hayes. They vanished. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't rage. He didn't punch the wall or shatter the expensive vases lining the hallway. The explosive, violent alpha anger that had terrified Elias at the expo was entirely, completely extinguished. Slowly, agonizingly, Arthur placed his hands flat on the carpet and pushed his massive frame off the floor. His joints popped, stiff from hours of motionless despair. He leaned heavily against the wall, his head hanging low, his icy blue eyes completely hollow, entirely devoid of life. "Gone," Arthur whispered, the word tasting like absolute ash in his dry mouth. He looked at the locked door one last time. Behind that wood was the only chance he had at redemption, and he had terrified them into fleeing into the night. "Do you want me to track the transport van, sir?" Jackson asked immediately, his hand already reaching for his encrypted radio. "I can have a full team on them within 10 minutes. We can intercept them on the highway before they reach the county line. I can have them brought back to the estate by noon." "No." Arthur's voice suddenly cracked like a whip, startling Jackson. Arthur aggressively ran a shaking hand through his messy hair, his chest heaving with a sudden, profound realization. "No, Jackson. Absolutely not. If you intercept them, if you surround them with armed men on a highway, you will absolutely terrify my children. You will prove to Julian that I am the exact, precise monster he believes me to be. I am not a kidnapper. I am not a tyrant anymore." Arthur closed his eyes, completely surrendering to the agonizing, excruciating truth of his completely shattered reality. He had spent 5 years ruthlessly commanding people, aggressively, violently forcing the world to bend entirely to his iron will. But you cannot command forgiveness. You cannot violently force a terrified, broken Omega to trust the hand that previously held the knife. "I cannot take them by force," Arthur murmured, opening his bloodshot eyes, a brand new, quiet, terrifyingly absolute resolve violently igniting within them. "I threw him into the freezing rain, Jackson. I completely stripped him of his dignity, his home, his voice, and his safety. I forced him to raise 5 infants in absolute, grinding poverty while I sat in a penthouse drinking imported whiskey. I do not deserve to simply walk back into his life and claim the title of a father." Jackson remained perfectly silent, completely recognizing that he was witnessing the profound, agonizing death and immediate rebirth of an alpha. Arthur meticulously folded Julian's devastating note and placed it securely in the breast pocket of his ruined shirt, directly over his violently breaking heart. "Call the board of directors," Arthur commanded, his voice entirely dropping its hollow tone, replaced by an unbreakable, terrifyingly focused determination. "Tell them I am taking an indefinite, completely open-ended leave of absence. Transfer full operational control of the Hayes Corporation to the executive committee immediately." Jackson's eyes widened in absolute shock. "Sir, the company, the mergers, you can't simply abandon the empire." "There is absolutely no empire without a legacy, Jackson," Arthur replied, his voice colder than liquid nitrogen. "And my entire legacy is currently fleeing down a highway in a rented van, entirely convinced I am a dead hero. I do not care if the entire corporation burns to absolute ash. I am going to get my family back." Arthur began walking down the hallway, his posture slowly straightening, the crippling despair completely morphing into a calculated, entirely unyielding, terrifying obsession. "Cancel all my appointments for the next year," Arthur instructed over his shoulder, his icy blue eyes completely locked on the elevator doors. "Liquidate 10% of my personal offshore assets into completely untraceable accounts. And Jackson." "Yes, Mr. Hayes?" "Find me an extremely discreet real estate agent in that pathetic, freezing little coastal town Julian lives in," Arthur ordered, stepping into the elevator. "I need a property. Something entirely unremarkable. Something directly across the street from the Silent Haven Bakery." The elevator doors began to slowly slide shut, obscuring Arthur's completely ruined, determined face. "I cannot violently force him to open his door," Arthur's deep, resonant voice echoed through the closing gap. "But I can sit completely outside of it in the freezing rain for the rest of my natural life until he finally decides I have completely bled enough to earn a single glance." 3 agonizing, deeply paranoid weeks had completely passed since our desperate, terrified escape from Lumina City. The small coastal town felt entirely different to me now. The quaint, charming streets and the salty ocean breeze that used to represent absolute safety and sanctuary now felt entirely exposed, like a fragile glass house completely waiting for a single, heavy stone to shatter it to pieces. Despite my overwhelming, suffocating anxiety, the Silent Haven was absolutely booming. The massive distribution contract I had secured at the Culinary Expo had completely transformed our lives. I had hired 3 new assistant bakers, upgraded all of my commercial ovens, and finally, mercifully, moved my children out of the drafty, freezing apartment above the shop and into a beautiful, secure, deeply secluded house on the edge of the cliffs overlooking the ocean. I was standing behind the main pastry counter, meticulously piping incredibly delicate vanilla bean frosting onto a fresh batch of cupcakes. The bakery was completely packed with local regulars and tourists, a loud, chaotic symphony of clinking coffee cups and warm laughter. But my dark eyes constantly, entirely instinctively, darted toward the massive front windows. I was constantly waiting for the absolute nightmare to begin. I was waiting for a fleet of entirely black, heavily armored SUVs to aggressively violently pull up to the curb. I was waiting for Arthur's ruthless, impeccably dressed corporate lawyers to aggressively burst through the door and slam a devastating, world-ending custody lawsuit directly onto my glass counter. I was waiting for the violent, aggressive retaliation of an alpha who had been completely denied his own blood. But absolutely nothing happened. There were no ominous phone calls. There were no terrifying private investigators aggressively snapping photos from parked cars. The complete, absolute silence from the Hayes Corporation was almost more terrifying than a direct, violent attack. It felt like standing directly on the beach, watching the ocean violently recede, completely knowing a massive, devastating tsunami was silently building on the horizon. "Run, darling," Mrs. Higgins called out from the back kitchen, entirely breaking my paranoid, spiraling thoughts. She walked out holding a massive, pristine clipboard, a completely bewildered look entirely dominating her wrinkled face. The delivery truck from the wholesale supplier just arrived. But there's a massive issue. I quickly wiped my hands on my apron and grabbed my small whiteboard from under the counter. What is wrong? Did they short our flour order again? No, entirely the opposite, Mrs. Higgins replied, shaking her head in absolute disbelief. They delivered 3 times the amount of our usual order. And, run, look at these incredibly detailed invoices. She handed me the clipboard. My eyes completely widened as I scanned the thick, aggressively detailed paperwork. The ingredients currently being unloaded into my back alley weren't the standard, commercial-grade supplies we usually bought. It was 50 massive sacks of the absolute highest grade, incredibly expensive organic flour imported directly from Italy. It was 20 gallons of the absolute purest, incredibly rare Tahitian vanilla extract. It was crates of the finest, absolute highest quality Belgian dark chocolate. It was tens of thousands of dollars worth of absolute, luxury premium ingredients. I aggressively grabbed my marker, my hands violently shaking. There is a massive mistake. I absolutely did not order this. We cannot possibly afford this. Tell the driver to stop unloading right now. I entirely tried, Mrs. Higgins said, her voice dropping to a deeply nervous whisper. The driver completely refused. He said the entire invoice, including the exorbitant shipping costs, was completely paid in full, in absolutely untraceable cash, by an entirely anonymous benefactor. He said the strict instructions were to completely ensure the Silent Haven only uses the absolute finest ingredients available on the planet. My heart completely stopped in my chest. Anonymous benefactor. Untraceable cash. The absolute finest ingredients on the planet. My breath hitched violently in my throat. I completely dropped the clipboard, the heavy plastic clattering aggressively against the floor. I instantly ran past Mrs. Higgins, completely ignoring the deeply confused stares of my customers, and aggressively violently threw open the heavy front door of the bakery. The freezing, entirely bitter coastal wind immediately slapped me across the face, aggressively violently whipping my apron around my legs. I stood on the sidewalk, my chest aggressively heaving, my wide, completely terrified eyes frantically scanning the quiet, familiar street. There were absolutely no black SUVs. There were entirely no imposing bodyguards. But directly across the street, standing completely still under the incredibly faded, entirely broken awning of a permanently closed, abandoned bookstore, was a completely solitary figure. He was entirely stripped of his massive, imposing billionaire armor. He wasn't wearing a custom-tailored, incredibly expensive suit. He wasn't wearing an incredibly expensive luxury watch. He was wearing a completely plain, incredibly heavy, dark woolen winter coat, the collar aggressively turned up against the freezing, biting wind. His hands were shoved deeply into his pockets. It was Arthur. He didn't aggressively cross the street. He didn't aggressively shout my name. He didn't completely storm my bakery and aggressively violently demand to completely see his incredibly beautiful children. He simply stood there, completely still, the freezing rain entirely soaking his incredibly messy brown hair, his icy blue eyes entirely locked onto my face. The absolute, undeniable look of complete, unadulterated devastation and entirely unending, deeply profound repentance radiating from his entire posture was entirely suffocating. He had entirely abandoned his massive corporate empire. He had completely surrendered his absolute, terrifying power. He had entirely moved into the absolute shadows of my completely new life, not as a terrifying conqueror aggressively violently seeking to entirely completely claim his incredibly perfect family, but as a completely broken, entirely pathetic ghost, completely violently desperately begging to absolutely entirely quietly exist in the absolute exact same atmosphere as the incredible people he had entirely violently destroyed. I aggressively entirely gripped the heavy brass handle of the bakery door, my knuckles turning entirely completely white, violently shaking with a complex, completely terrifying mixture of pure, unadulterated fury, absolutely crippling fear, and an entirely deeply buried, aggressively entirely treacherous, completely undeniable ache in my absolute deeply broken, entirely violently shattered heart. The devastating, entirely agonizing, completely terrifying war of absolute, unending attrition had completely entirely officially begun. And the incredibly terrifying, absolutely monstrous alpha had completely rewritten every absolutely single, entirely completely violent rule of the absolutely devastating engagement. End of story.